This video has been made with the purpose of education and awareness of real crimes, and there is no disrespect intended to anyone. This is to help promote truth and justice for anyone who has been a victim of crime. What I'm about to report is what I have researched online, and I will welcome any corrections should they be required. Hello there, Little Berry true crime fans. Eryberrie here, back with a regular type of video now. So just a straight report, not reacting to anything. Although I have been asked to react to the Stephen McDaniel case, which I will do. I'll probably do it this evening. I'm not sure, but that'll be up very, very shortly. But we're going back to the normal stuff. That reaction that I've been doing is not going to be the main focus of this channel. It's still going to be the normal reporting. I have had some case suggestions. I already have a bank of cases that I want to work through this year, but I will try and fit in others around that, or I might have to do the requested cases next year because I've already planned the entire of 2022. Any feedback would be great because this is your channel really, and I want to be able to do what you would like me to do on this channel. Like if you want me to speak it slower, if you want me to show you more or less pictures. At the moment, I don't have access to stock footage or stock pictures. If I ever do, then I'll include them. If you want me to change the music, anything like that at all, anything constructive, I'll be open to. Today, we are going across to Japan and looking at a case there which is unsolved. Now, it's my first unsolved case on this channel for quite some time. It's one that really haunts people because it's not because of the lack of evidence or for the lack of police work. It seems that it is just purely bad luck that this hasn't been solved. It is still open. It's almost 22 years old, this case, and 35 Japanese detectives are working on this case. It's something that needs a lot of help. There must be someone out there who knows what really happened and who did this. When I was growing up, my mum played host to many Japanese students. I think at least 15 to 20 passed through our house at some point. And my experience of Japanese people and the Japanese culture is they are extremely polite, very courteous, and the Japanese crime rate isn't that high, to be honest. So when something of this nature happens, it's a huge deal. And there are some other unsolved or solved cases in Japan which are very, very harrowing. And there's one case in particular of the case of Junko Furuta. I will not be covering that case on this channel. I appreciate people may want me to. I already know quite a lot about that case, but it's so awful, it's so horrific that I have read and seen way too much of that. I don't want to go through it again. And there are many other YouTubers who've covered it. In Japan, they have certain customs and etiquette which are culture-centric, which they are in most cases in the world. Like a particular hand gesture in one part of the world will be considered okay in one, or meaning something in another, but meaning something completely different and considered offensive in another. So in Japan, one of the customs is, and a lot of people in the Western world have this as well, like in my country, is when you go to somebody's house, even in your own house, the first thing you do is you take your shoes off. That's something my mum wasn't really too bothered about until I was around 10 years old, and then she instituted that law, and it was shoes off, put them on the shoe rack before you even walk in. That took a while to get used to, but eventually I got used to taking the shoes off, and it makes sense. If you're wearing footwear outside of the house, you potentially have some unmentionables on your shoes that you don't want to bring inside. That is important to this case. In Japan, they are very, very conscious about cleanliness and hygiene. I've seen so many places in Japan that are just pristine. The Japanese culture is just so beautiful and so just awe-inspiring. When you think of Japan, one of the first things you think of is the nation's capital, Tokyo. Tokyo is massive in terms of both population, density of that population, and how fast and how vast the buildings and the industry is in those areas. Inner Tokyo is seen as rather cramped. So it's very, very high-rise built up, and the population is really, really thick there. But in certain parts of Tokyo, on the outskirts of Tokyo, it's less so. There are places in Tokyo which, even though they're in the nation's capital, they're on the outskirts, so they are more suburban. A bit like how you'd have in London. London is divided up into boroughs or districts or just estates and areas. Like you've got Islington, Paddock Wood, Bethnal Green, places like that. And it's no different in Tokyo. There are certain what's called special wards. One of those wards is called Setagaya. Now, a lot of people have said that Setagaya is Tokyo's second biggest district. Well, it is Tokyo's second biggest ward, but it's a little bit misleading to call it a district because there are different names for different areas of these special wards. So the place in Setagaya we are going to focus on, I'm going to have to look at my notes here, is pronounced Kamisoshigaya. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So we're going to focus on that particular area of the special ward of Setagaya in Tokyo. In the year 2000, I was 16 then, and it was huge, massive. That was the year of the Sydney Olympic Games. People thought the Millenium bug was going to end technology as we knew it. It didn't happen. But for the following year, we were in a completely new era. It was quite amazing. In Japan, their custom of welcoming the new year is a lot more meaningful than many people it is in the world. Like, for example, for myself, it's up to you what you do. You can spend it with friends and family if you want. You can go out if you want, you can stay in if you want, you can sleep through it if you want, you can do whatever you want. If it falls at a weekend, that's brilliant. I remember one New Year, I think it was 2005, which did fall at a weekend. I had a great time that night. If you're in a culture that celebrates the New Year by spending time with family, especially at the end of the year 2000, that was when Japan was going to officially welcome the new millennium because of the Y2K scare. This was no different for the Miyazawa family. The Miyazawa family consisted of Mikio, who was 44 at the time of this incident, his wife Yasuko, who was 41, and they had two children, Niina, who was 8, and Rei, who was 6. Mikio worked for a company called Interbrand. They are massive, they are huge. They were the company that coined the term Wi-Fi, and I believe they actually branded it Wi-Fi. So he worked for them. Interbrand are mostly based in London, but they have bases all over the world. Yasuko was a teacher. She was very, very well liked and very well appreciated with her school. Mikio was seen as just an easygoing, peace-loving, easy to get along with man. This family were pretty well liked. They were pretty well respected. They were just an average family with 2.4 kids. Niina was very active. She loved to play ballet, but she also loved to play soccer as well. She was equally as interested in those two sports. Little Rei, he was just starting to, establish himself. He was only 6 years old. He unfortunately had a speech impediment, which was causing quite a bit of stress in the family. They were trying to find specialists who could help him. And there was another problem in the family that Yasuko particularly was concerned would exacerbate or cause further stress with regard to Rei and the rest of the family. And that is because when they moved into that district in the year 1990, so they'd been there 10 years, at the time there were 200 families living in this lovely suburban area. At the back of the Miyazawa's house, separated by a fence, just a very, very low fence, pretty close to the wall of the home, was a park, and it was called the Choo-Choo Train Park, or the Choo-Choo Park. It was just your normal swings and slides park. But this park was, even though it had been there for quite some time, it was starting to expand, and a skater park was being set up quite near there. Now, skater parks are very different to a kids' swings and slides park. The city had been buying off people who were living in that area, buying their houses from them so they could be demolished to make way for expanding this park. Now, to give you a bit of an idea, as I said, there were 200 families that lived in that area in the year 1990 when the Miyazawas first moved in. And this was all little Niina and Rei knew. At the time of this incident, the only families that lived there were the Miyazawas, Yasuko's mother and sister and her husband, who actually lived next door to the Miyazawas, more on that in a bit, and 2 other families that lived down the road. 4 houses were left there. The Miyazawas did not want to leave. They loved it there. They'd been there 10 years, but if in certain places, if the city is saying, we want to demolish this and here's some money for it, you can say, no, I'm going to stay put, but you're not going to have that much power when they force you out. And it turned out that the Miyazawas had relented. They had accepted an offer for their house. They were going to move within a few months of the year 2001. Yasuko was still not happy about it. It would probably cause some upset for little Ray, but they really didn't have much choice, particularly as the skater park, I don't want to generalize, but the people that attend these parks, that, you know, young people mostly, they do get a bit rowdy, a bit noisy. It upsets Mikio a lot because he had 2 small kids. He didn't want them to get upset, especially Ray. Also, he worked from home a lot. He needed, you know, quiet time. Apparently, he had confronted a few of the people using the skater park a few times to keep the noise down because it was right outside their house. This didn't go down too well, and there were some confrontations between Mikio and some people who are members of a motorcycle gang. The family had a few months left in this place. They could have waited it out, but even if you wait it out, it can really take its toll. And to ask people in a skater park, which is a park erected and set up especially for people to, you know, skate around and have fun, it's difficult to ask them to keep the noise down in an area which is specifically designated for them to have that kind of fun. Next door to the Miyazawas lived Yasuko's mother, who I've seen 2 different names for her. One is Haruko and the other one is Ashai. But I'm going to call her Haruko. That is the main name I've been able to find. Haruko lived there, although the neighbouring house, because it was like a semi-detached house. If I lived in a semi-detached house when I was growing up, or if you can imagine a terraced house with conjoined houses together in a block. So if you imagine one house and another house joined together with nobody either side. So it was a large dwelling divided into 2 self-contained properties. Yasuko's sister Anne, she actually owned the neighbouring house. Anne and her husband had actually lived in the UK for quite some time, for about 8 years before they moved back home. And during that time, Haruko was actually living next door. Mikio he didn't object to this very close living with family. He was a bit concerned about, imagine if your family lives very close to you, sometimes it can get a bit funny. He thought it would be best to install soundproofing in the dividing wall. In keeping with the Japanese customs about being polite and courteous, even if Haruko wanted to come over and visit her daughter and son-in-law, or if the daughter and son-in-law of the family wanted to visit her, they would telephone each other first, just out of pure courtesy. And I think that's a very, very polite and nice thing to do. I'm not going to go on about my own family, but this hits home to me because it's a very family kind of setting. Is my mum had an open door policy. Anyone could come in whenever they wanted. They didn't have to ring first. Some people did, but they would just turn up. So my mum's philosophy was always to have an open and presentable house at all times. Anyone who came in, they got first dibs on the chairs and the sofa. We had to sit on the floor. We always had to make tea and any food that they wanted. And if they helped themselves to food, we had to clean up. I mean, it was that kind of house. Whereas now, how I am, I'm not that keen on having an open door policy, because sometimes you just want time to yourself. Or what if you're not feeling well? You don't necessarily want company unless you know specifically they're coming over. And that was the same with the Miyazawa family. They were very polite and courteous to one another, who live literally next door and nobody else was about. Just them. You could just walk out of the front door of one house and to the front door of the other house. It's just polite to say, are you free? Can I come over for a cup of tea? This demolishing of the houses hadn't been going on for very long, only about a year. So it wasn't as if the Miyazawas knew that they had to get this sorted right immediately. This was actually put on them very, very quickly. So the New Year, or Omisoka, which is the Japanese New Year tradition, they were going to celebrate the coming of the Millenium in 2001. And on the 30th of December, so the day before New Year's Eve, the Miyazawas went out shopping, and then they came home. And that evening, Yasuko phoned her mother and asked if Niina could come over to hers to watch a television program. Niina went over, she watched television with her grandmother, and then came back home. The next events that happened were mysterious and extremely horrific and upsetting. And I will give a warning that this does involve child murder. What's really horrible about this is not only that this involves the murder of innocent people, how they were killed, and the fact that who it was has never been brought to justice. So I will give you that warning now. Leading up to that day though, on Christmas Day, Yasuko actually reported that a car had been parking in front of the house. She'd seen that a few times, and that was very strange because where their house was situated, parking in front of the house meant that to get anywhere, they would have to literally jump the fence to get into the park, to be able to go anywhere really. And there were parking spots not far away, so why were they parking outside of the house? Now, to my knowledge, she hadn't confronted whoever it was. And the description of the car, to my knowledge, hasn't been made public. 2 days after this, a man who was described as being in his 40s, although wearing skater type attire, so tracky bottoms, hoodie, hat, and trainers, was seen walking around the Miyazawa home. Now, that didn't seem implausible because people, especially in that attire, did walk around the area, but in hindsight, given what had happened, it did look a bit strange. On the 29th, a person was seen at a railway station just a few miles away, again wearing skater-like clothing. This doesn't seem to be much of a concern. I mean, loads of people go to the train station and loads of people wear this type of attire, except what they were wearing was not very warm, and this was winter, and winter in Japan gets pretty cold. So it was noticed at how not dressed for the weather this person was. Another person was spotted the day that the Miyazawa's last full day alive was, which was on the 30th, at another train station, this time closer to the Miyazawas. This person was also seen in a shopping centre purchasing a sashimi knife. Again, that's going to be important. The last known activity, which was believed to have been made by the Miyazawas, most importantly Mikio, before anything happened, was at 10:38 p.m. when Mikio was on his computer. So the history, his browser history, was traced to that time. He was using his computer. He had actually accessed an encrypted email, which needed a password to open it, and it was a very personal password. It was very unlikely to have been anyone else. One more thing which is notable is that around 10 o'clock, someone walking past the house said they heard raised voices coming from inside. Now, they didn't think it was anything other than a domestic, which it potentially could have been. It may be relevant to this case, it may not, but it's noteworthy. At about 11:30 that night, now bear in mind the dividing wall between the houses was soundproofed, Haruko and Anne reported that they heard a thud. It was either one thud or several thuds at about 11:30 coming from next door. That time of night, you'd think, a bit odd. But if the wall is soundproofed and you're hearing that, it would have been a much louder noise if you'd been in close proximity. I don't know why they didn't call next door or telephone and say, is everything okay there? But it wasn't enough to cause suspicion. The following day, Yasuko's mother Haruko, she picked up the phone and telephoned next door to ask if she could come over, but the connection didn't go through. She tried again, same thing. It wasn't engaged. The phone was either off the hook or had been completely disconnected. That was very odd. So she decided to walk around. She went to the front door, knocked, nothing, knocked again, nothing. She had a spare key, so she thought this is a bit strange, especially as the car was still in the driveway. She hadn't seen anyone leave, and they normally would be up and about at this time in the morning. The first thing she reported feeling was that it just felt very eerily silent. As if people literally, when you just leave your house and there's no television on, the heating's not on, nothing. It's just quiet. As she walked through, she had a clear view to the bottom of the stairs, and there she saw the bloodied and battered dead body of her son-in-law Mikio. There was blood absolutely everywhere. He was most definitely dead and cold and lifeless. He was covered in stab wounds to his face, his neck, and his head. There were also found to be stab wounds on his thighs and his buttocks. He appeared to have fallen or been thrown down the stairs, hence why he was there at the bottom of the stairs where he had died. Despite the horrors that she was facing, the first thing Haruko thought is, where is my daughter and my grandchildren? So she climbed the stairs, which were blood-soaked, and at the top of the stairs, she saw the bodies of her daughter Yasuko and her granddaughter Niina, who were also both beaten, bloody, and covered in stab wounds, more so than Mikio was. Mikio had been stabbed numbers of times, but Niina and Yasuko had been stabbed mostly around the face. Little Niina had been stabbed horrifically in the back as well. These two people were seen crouched on the floor, back to back. They appeared to have been treated way worse than Mikio, even though Mikio had been treated pretty badly. They had been stabbed and beaten to death, but these two, Niina and Yasuko, were severely injured and damaged. Unfortunately, they both had passed away and had been cold and lifeless for some time. Haruko did put her hands on them both to check for signs of life. She couldn't find any, and then she thought, my grandson, Ray, where is he? She went to his room and found little Ray in his bed. He was also dead, but he hadn't been beaten and he hadn't been stabbed. He'd been strangled. Somebody had used their bare hands, not a ligature. There was no blood on him, no marks on him. He'd been strangled to death. Haruko ran out of the house. This was about 10:30. 2 generations of her family had been wiped out overnight. And the night before, little Niina had been at her house watching television with her, and now she was gone. When the police arrived and they commenced their investigation, they were met with a horrific scene. This appeared to have been a mass family murder, but the person who had carried it out didn't just kill the family. They did some things in that house which were very odd, very strange, completely baffled the police. When the coroner and pathologists, etc., when they examined the bodies, just as Haruko had discovered, Mikio had been stabbed horrifically. It was Yasuko who was beaten more severely and stabbed more severely, and little Niina had really suffered horrifically. There were some teeth missing as well. She'd been stabbed in the back at one point, and it was this stab wound that killed her because it severed her spine. I mean, how is an 8-year-old who's defenseless going to be a problem for you? Why would you want to be so horrific to a little child? The discrepancy between how 3 members of the family were killed and then one other who was killed in a completely different way was another thing which the police even to this day still don't know why. The murder weapons, as there were 2, were still at the crime scene. And one of them was the earlier purchased sashimi knife. Another one was a general kitchen knife, which did belong to the Miyazawas. Both had been used in these frenzied stabbings, and both had been left behind by the perpetrator. The tip of the sashimi knife, so, the metal part, had been broken off, and the broken fragment was found inside Mikio's head. So it had been used with such force, really brutally, that it had actually broken off inside Mikio's head. Because that knife had been purchased that day, it had been brought along to the house purely for the purpose of committing murder. And the broken knife was still used even after it broke. But it was thought that the perpetrator had gone to the Miyazawa's kitchen and retrieved the kitchen knife because that would be a better weapon to use than a broken sashimi knife. There was a plethora of evidence in that house, and I mean a lot of evidence. Now, as I go through this, it's going to be really, really baffling. It's going to be really strange, but it's very important to note exactly what was left behind at this scene, because there wasn't nothing for the police to use. There was, if anything, too much. The way the police believe the killer entered the house was through the second floor bathroom window. As the mosquito cover on the outside had been pulled off, the window was open, there were some broken branches of a tree nearby, which the police believe the perpetrator used to get to that window. However, it still would be pretty hard for someone to scale that window, and why use that window when there would have been other windows? And why not just break in the front door or use deception to get in? But either way, that's how the police believe the perpetrator entered the house. That bathroom is right next door to Ray's bedroom. Another reason why the police believe that it was this window that was used to gain entrance is because there was no reason for the Miyazawas to expect anyone to call over at that time after 10:30 in the evening, which is when the police believe the Miyazawas were there on their own. Well, that's what they believe, that they were there on their own at that time. I mean, who calls this late at night without making telephone contact, and who would stay that late at night as a visitor? It is believed that little Ray was the first victim. Not only was his bedroom right outside of that bathroom, if the killer had made any kind of noise and woken him up, Ray could have screamed, he could have called out saying, "Who's that?" and that would have alerted the family. The killer had to silence Ray first. And the way they did that by asphyxiating him essentially around his neck meant that he couldn't cry out. He probably did cry out, only a little bit though. But I mean, it's so hard. It really is hard to strangle a human being with your bare hands. Even a child, it's going to be hard to do. Because so many times when people are strangled and they fall limp and they appear to be dead, sometimes they're just in a deep state of unconsciousness because of the lack of oxygen to the brain. So the killer wrapped their hands around the boy's throat. That was the first victim, and they had to do it in a silent way. And so by stabbing the boy, he would have screamed, it would have alerted his parents and Niina, and the likelihood is that the killer may have been overpowered by both parents. The order of the subsequent events is even more debated as to whether or not it was Ray who was first to die, although Ray being the first to die does make more sense. But the order of the next deaths is very much debated, but I'm going to give you the most accepted version, although there are arguments to and from. We can discuss in the comments below as to what you think this is, or if you've seen anything different to what I'm reporting here. Go for it. Mikio, who was on the first floor, bear in mind this happened the floor above, he was working on his computer and he likely heard something and went up to investigate. And he was either jumped on by the killer or he found the killer in Ray's room and he attacked the killer, but they had a knife. Mikio was probably unarmed because he didn't, of course, you're not going to think that someone has got into an upstairs bedroom and is armed. You think, is somebody up and needing help, or is son sleepwalking or anything like that. His wife and his daughter, if they were up and about. So Mikio and the killer fight. Mikio is unarmed. He's ultimately overpowered. He's stabbed so many times, but he fights. He's trying to protect his family. And little Ray, he probably didn't know, he probably didn't see Ray dead in his bed, because Ray's crib was on the other side of the wall that hid the hallway, the upstairs hallway, from view. so Mikio most likely didn't know what had happened to his son. The blows to Mikio's head damaged the knife, but the killer didn't stop. And ultimately, Mikio was pushed down the stairs or fell unconscious and then down the stairs, where he ultimately passed away. His ultimate cause of death was blood loss from the multiple stab wounds, rather than any kind of damage from being thrown down the stairs. At the point that he hit the bottom, he would have been too weak to get up. So it was at that point that he bled out and died. At some point, though, in this fight, Mikio had managed to inflict some sort of damage, some sort of injury on the killer, either turning the weapon against them or using something else that was around to cause a cut or a wound. The belief is that Yasuko and Niina were in the third floor, which was an attic, on the futon bed, either watching television or asleep together, and they had either not heard what was going on because of the television, or they slept through it. The attic was only accessible through a ladder which you can pull down from an opening in the ceiling, and as it opens, the ladder comes down. The perpetrator then either searched the house, tried to find them, or they knew where they were. They probably heard them upstairs. The perpetrator then is thought to have attacked Niina and Yasuko in the bed, in the futon bed, because of the blood spattering and patterns upstairs. There was also a tissue with Niina's blood, which was thought to stem some of the blood flow that Niina had sustained. But it's unclear as to which point that happened, because when someone is stabbing you and your child in such a frenzied manner, at what point do you have enough time to get a tissue and hold it to your child's wound, unless she did that when she was trying to run away? And it is believed she did try and run away, because there was blood trail down the ladder and also to the point at the top of the stairs, which is where she and Niina died. Niina was severely beaten and stabbed. Yasuko quite a lot as well. And what was interesting is that Mikio to a certain point, but mostly these two, were stabbed way after they died. This seemed as a very personal, passionate, anger-filled. Didn't seem at all like a robbery that went bad, because normally when a robbery goes wrong and they have to kill witnesses, they'll do so in the quickest way possible without expending so much energy or facilities, and they would hightail it out of there. Yet the killer didn't do that. They didn't leave. Despite there being a family next door, despite them potentially having called the police, the perpetrator didn't leave for a long time. From the evidence that was collected in the house, this is what the police believe the killer did. After committing these vile murders, they went to the kitchen and helped themselves to barley tea. There was Coca-Cola and there was beer in the fridge, but the killer's preference was the barley tea. They then took out 4 cups of ice cream and very strangely didn't use a spoon or anything at all to scoop out the ice cream. They literally just squeezed the tub and just bit on the ice cream. They then got a Band-Aid from the kitchen and used that to patch up any kind of wound they had. Their blood was found on the first aid kit. Also, Niina's blood was found on the first aid kit and on some sanitary pads that were found around as well, containing both the killer's blood and Niina's blood. It's not known if Yasuko managed to get to the first aid kit first to tend to Niina's wounds, or if the killer used the pads to wipe off Niina's blood, because most of her blood would be on them. If it were Yasuko that had used the first aid kit, part of me thinks, well, why didn't she just run out of the house and call for help? They wouldn't have been able to call for help because the killer had disconnected the phone line. It's likely that happened first. But it's possible that Yasuko thought that the killer had fled, had somehow got out, so she felt that she was safe enough to at least give Niina some sort of rudimentary first aid before calling an ambulance or going next door to ask for help. But the killer, of course, hadn't gone, and they dispatched the whole family. This was overkill, literally. This was a case of, why use that much effort and time after someone's died to continually stab their bodies. It has been speculated that the killer was a misogynist, someone who didn't like women. And that's why Yasuko and Niina received the most brutal deaths, but why the little girl more so? And why was Ray given the most mercy in a way? And what strikes me is, I don't know if anybody else has thought of this, is he had a speech impediment, so there was something that, maybe a problem with his throat or, psychological, whichever it is. But that was where he was killed. I don't know whether it was symbolic or the killer knew. Then the killer got a bit tired and decided to have a kip on their sofa. For how long? It's not known, but the blood smearing and the patterns on the sofa show that the killer did actually have a nap on their sofa, not caring at all about whether or not the police may have been on their way. It was also possible for the police to be able to deduce the patterns of the blood staining on the sofa with the clothing that the killer was wearing, because the killer left all except their underwear at the house, along with other belongings. I'm going to list them here. So there was the sashimi knife that was left behind, a green tartan scarf which couldn't be traced anywhere. It's been thought that it was like a freebie giveaway with something else, but it couldn't have been traced. A black and white long sleeve t-shirt or a sweater, a black jacket, a bucket hat which was sort of like grey and it was knitted, some gloves and some Slazenger trainers or sneakers, whichever you call them, 2 black handkerchiefs which had strangely been ironed. There was also a hip bag, also known as a bum bag or a fanny pack, wherever you are, whatever you call it, which was green and black in colour. It was indeed sold in Japan a couple of years before, but it was actually manufactured in Korea. Now, what was inside this bag? Very, very strange. There was grip tape, which is usually the type used on skateboards. Now, remember we said that the attire that was left behind, like what a skater would wear. And there was grip tape in this bag. Some hair, thought to be of the killer, and some red luminescent fluid or liquid or substance which somehow connected to potentially the manufacturing of crystal meth. But the most interesting detail they found inside this bum bag was sand, and the sand was traced to California, and it was pinpointed to a very specific place, which is the Edwards Air Force Base in California. Now, this threw Japanese police because they would not have thought of this person being or having been near an Air Force base in the US. Was it possible that they were a US soldier or a US military person who was staying in Japan? What if the bum bag didn't actually belong to the killer? What if it had been stolen or borrowed or bought secondhand? It did give some credence to the theory that the perpetrator must have had a military background because of the physical ability it would have required to scale that wall, even with a tree, to get in that window and to have the strength to strangle somebody with their bare hands and to overpower Mikio and to deliver the amount of stab wounds to all of those individuals. A military background didn't seem too implausible. And if that wasn't enough, one of the handkerchiefs, or both, one or both of them, had been ironed. Who irons a handkerchief? Military personnel. And one of the handkerchiefs was thought to have been used as a grip on one of the knives, possibly the sashimi knife, because there was a hole which was not by design in the middle of it, so it probably been used by the perpetrator to hold onto the knife. The grip tape could give credit to another theory that this was a result of Mikio's confrontation with the skater park people. I can understand having that kind of confrontation is a pain and it may have caused some sort of problem, but why would it then mean that you'd go and kill a whole family? They didn't have a problem with the wife, let alone the kids. The Miyazawas had quite a bit of money lying around the house, both in the currency of yen and a little bit in foreign currency. It's thought that the killer stole about 150,000 yen from the house, but there was around 200,000 yen and some small foreign currency literally sitting there in plain sight that hadn't been touched. No other valuables had been taken, apart from one of Mikio's jackets. So this person slept on the sofa, removed their clothing, and they also rifled through the family's private documents and drawers, took several of their documents and even one of the ice cream cups and dumped them in the bathtub. They also, disgustingly, they took a shit in the toilet, which you're supposed to do in a toilet, didn't flush it, and then put some of the other documents and a couple of things in the toilet on top of it. Why? The police were so keen to find out who this person is, they were not prepared to let any stone be left unturned, to the point that they actually had the fecal matter analysed to see what diet this person was on. And the day before, they had, I believe it was sesame seeds and string beans, but that wasn't going to give them much to go on. The clothing was also found to have been washed. Now, this is how far they went. They analysed how the clothing had been laundered. Some of the items of clothing had been bought new and some had been worn for some time. They had been washed in hard water, which is not used in Japan. In Japan, they use soft water. The Slazenger trainers, even though in Japan you can buy Slazenger shoes, but these particular shoes had not been sold in Japan. They'd been sold in South Korea because of the size of the shoe is only one that is sold in South Korea, not in Japan. There were a few South Korean links to this case, so the Japanese police did ask South Korea for help, but unfortunately they declined. The killer also logged onto Mikio's computer. This was around 1:17 a.m. and the reason it is believed that this was not Mikio is because the killer only checked the bookmarked sites. They did actually set up a new folder, I'm not sure what they put in there, and they tried to buy theatre tickets. So this was around 1:17 a.m. Mikio would not normally be up at this time. When analysing the computer, the police discovered something else, that around 10 a.m. that morning, the morning that Haruko found the family, that the computer connected to the internet again, and it was then unplugged from the wall. Was the killer still in the house at this time? It's very unlikely. They would have had very little time to escape and escape without being seen. It was widely believed for years and years that the killer was still in the house at the time. However, in 2013, after extensive experimentation and trial, the police decided that actually this was not quite true. The computer didn't connect to the internet because of somebody using it. It was because when Haruko ran out of the house, she accidentally nudged the mouse of the computer, which fell to the floor and reactivated the computer so it reconnected to the internet. That was tested and tried a number of times. The same make and model of computer was used, and a reenactment of what they believe had been done was done a number of times, and it did work. It worked every time. So it is believed that Haruko, when she entered the house, she ran through the house and accidentally nudged the mouse. The point of entry is still questionable. Yes, the mosquito net had been removed and it had actually been slashed as well. The branches were broke. And Ray was thought to have been first because of there was no blood stains on him or anything like that. But the window wouldn't have been the easiest way to gain entry. And also, you can never guarantee that the coast will be clear. How did the perpetrator know if someone's going to be using that bathroom at that time, or if somebody was near? How would they know that the coast would be clear and that they'd be able to get through without making too much noise to attract attention? Surely it would have been easier to have rang the doorbell and ambushed them, or possibly this person was known to the Miyazawas and had been let in and had probably been inside for some time before the murders actually took place. It could be there was more than one assailant. It could be there was one that was distracting Mikio at the front door, and another one that climbed in through the window at the time. Each one of those items of clothing was traced to a particular place in Tokyo, but they haven't been able to trace exactly who bought them and to whom they belonged. Mikio was also dressed in work attire that late at night. Normally you'd be in your PJs or your leisure clothing at about 11:30 at night, when he was last at least known to have been on the internet or believed to have been on the internet. Unless he was expecting somebody or somebody was there. Going back to the window, there were footprints found on the ground below the window. So this did give credence to potentially the murderer standing below the window to look up before scaling the tree, or they jumped out of the window. It was a point of exit as opposed to entry. But then after committing the murders and being so audacious as to use the house for their own personal use, why didn't they just walk out the front door? Well, they could have done, but it would have attracted attention probably from either Haruko or someone would have seen them. They could have tried to get out of a window that was lower to the ground and bigger. So I don't buy that. If the murderer had been let in the house through the front door, they would have, if they had been let in, if they were known to the Miyazawas, they would have taken their shoes off. But then what was found is that in Mikio's blood, there were footprints in those shoe prints going up the stairs from the middle of the stairs only. So did the perpetrator pick up their shoes and then put them on halfway up the stairs? But then there weren't any bare feet prints anywhere. That is another thing that's odd. In Ray's room, there were a lot of footprints from these shoes, but the killer could have easily have just after checking that, that he killed Mikio and killed Yasuko and Niina, or one or the other, could have gone back to Ray's room just to double check that he was definitely dead. Why they put their shoes on at the halfway point of the stairs and then walked up and then carried on walking around the house, it's thought maybe that's because of, blood being slippery. It was to give them extra grip, but even trainers can be slippery when dealing with things like, blood or a slippery kind of like substance. That could have been it, or they didn't want to leave their bare footprints because bare footprints could give people more clue as to who you are. But then they left their clothing behind, they left their blood behind, and not to mention an abundance of fingerprints. They could have found a lower window because jumping from that, would have been pretty hard to do. There was a fence right there. They would have landed straight on the fence. So why go to the potential of injuring yourself, jumping out that window when you could easily have got out of somewhere else? Yes, it would have been more difficult for Yasuko's mother to have seen them or the family next door to have seen them, but that could have been the case anyway. There were some suspects. There was a man a few hours away at a train station who had a very severe cut on his arm, which was so severe that it exposed bone. He was treated at the station, but he refused to give his name or who he was. But the police don't believe that to be the killer because at the house, if the killer stayed there for some time and had such a severe wound on their arm, they wouldn't have stayed in the house very long, or they would have used bigger methods to have tried to stem the blood flow. But in this case, they only used a band-aid. Yes, they used some sanitary pads, but that still is not in keeping with the kind of wound that this man had. A taxi driver as well noticed that he picked up 3 people. Again, it could have been more than one, or at least a few other people may have known about it or been indirectly involved. He picked up 3 men around the same kind of area that late at night, and they were very quiet, these 3 men, so that just kind of aroused suspicion. At the time of the murders, DNA testing was around, it was useful. Not as prevalent as it is today, but it's still quite strong. The blood type was A. The killer was found to have been male. His DNA and fingerprints were run against 1.3 million people, including the family and friends and acquaintances, any persons of interest in the case, as well as everybody else in the database. Not a single match. The DNA that makes us who we are is found in the nucleus of our cells in the 46 chromosomes. But there is DNA held in the mitochondria, which is called the powerhouse of the cell where respiration takes place. That particular DNA is inherited only from the mother. So the mitochondrial DNA was something that the police did look at, and it was found that the mother of this person was either Southern European or had a Southern European parent. However, the paternal DNA was not too much of a help because it showed that this person most likely was Japanese, but they could have been Chinese or even Korean. When it comes to genealogical DNA, that seems like a really good way to go. The problem is, though, if you think of countries such as, America and the UK, which are multicultural, multiracial, there are lots of expats, coming in, coming out. However, with Japan, the population in there is homogenous, meaning that they don't have many people who are immigrants in their genetic pool. So finding out a family tree when this person was half Japanese, most likely, isn't that easy. And it hasn't been able to be narrowed down exactly which Southern European country the mother or the mother's parents or one of their parents came from. So that doesn't really help either. 280,000 police officers were working on this case, but to this day, nobody knows who this killer is. Nobody has been able to link the sand from America, the Korean ties, why the killer did what they did in the house. And there were no known enemies to this family apart from the people in the skater park. Is it possible that the killer is more close to home? And even if somebody who's related to the family or known to the family didn't physically commit the murders, was this a contract killing? It may have been committed by a mercenary, sellsword, or whichever, but it's somebody who has been able to evade justice and also not been caught for any kind of criminal law at all in Japan. Otherwise, their details will be in the database and they're not. There is one good thing to have come out of this, if there is anything good to say about 4 people being killed. In Japan, they did have a 25-year statute of limitations for criminal offences that could result in the death penalty, which include murders. But in 2010, that was overturned. So really, this killer could have waited 25 years and then gone, yeah, I did it, and then got off. Now they can't. Not at all. Murder should never have a statute of limitation. This kind of crime, any serious crime, should never have a statute of limitation. And I'm so pleased that the Japanese government changed this. I really do wish the 35 detectives that are working on this case the best of luck, because this really does need to be solved. The house, to my knowledge, is still standing. The family don't want it demolished. It's the last vestige they have of this family, and I completely understand that to a certain degree. I mean, the city did want to destroy it because it is crumbling now. It needs a lot of work done to it if it's going to stay, but I will say with the greatest of respect, keeping that house isn't going to bring the family back, and the family have no use for that house now. So unless it's going to go to somebody else, if it's just going to sit there, if all the evidence has been collected and there's no use for it now, if it does need to come down because it's a hazard, I can understand why. But at the same time, I can understand the family not wanting it to go. It's a hard one. If the person who committed these murders is still alive and is watching this video, do the right thing and hand yourself in, you coward. You are an absolute coward for doing what you did, especially to defenseless children. You've had your 22 years of freedom, now pay for it. If you know anything about this case, please get in contact with the relevant Japanese police department. Tell them anything that you know, anything that you think might be relevant or irrelevant, or if you think you may know who did this, please tell them. This needs to be solved because that family is still suffering. Thank you for watching, guys. I appreciate all the support you're giving me. I do want to get to that golden 1,000 subscribers because I want to start monetizing this channel, because I want to turn this into a job. I want to turn this into a business. Please help me make that happen. If you've got Twitter, if you've got Facebook, if whatever social media you've got, please put this channel out there. Let them know that this channel is here and get them to come over here and subscribe and comment and like and all of that lovely stuff, because it helps greatly. I'd appreciate it. And I love talking to you guys. So if you put a comment down below, the likelihood is I'll see it and reply to it. Once I hit the 500 subscriber mark, I can then start adding posts to my channel, and that will be brilliant because then I can chat more to people. So yeah, keep it going. And I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook. Please hit me up. I'm on TikTok as well, but I don't use it so much. But either way, thank you again for watching. And if you have any case suggestions, just put them in the comments below before I have any other kind of platform to put them, and I'll make a note of all of them. Thank you so much. Bye.